The story I'm going to tell you today is about a strange ATM that gave a person unlimited money every night, even when his account balance was zero. Although this person was just an ordinary waiter working in a bar, this ATM made him a millionaire, allowing him to live the life he had always wanted to live. Because this person had earned so much money from this ATM that he could spend his entire life very comfortably in any corner of the world. But due to his own foolishness, he was caught. And then the world discovered a fraud that no one was ready to believe. So who was this person? What did he find in that ATM that changed his life forever? And how was he caught by the police? This story, which no one has heard or seen before, begins in Australia, where on a night in 2011, a person named Dan reaches an ATM because Dan was completely drunk. And when he puts his credit card into that ATM machine, something happens that changes his entire life forever. Dan was a resident of Melbourne, Australia, where he worked in a casino. His job in the casino was to serve alcohol to people who came for gambling, since he had often seen many people win large amounts in gambling. This had such an impact on his mind that many twists would come in this story later. While working in this casino, Dan meets a girl, and just a few days later, they both get engaged. A few days after the engagement, this girl gets a job in a small town called Wantala in Australia. So she has to shift from Melbourne to Wantala. Since Dan had also fallen deeply in love with this girl, he also shifts to Wantala with her. After shifting to Wantala, Dan tried his hand at many different jobs, from cleaner to waiter, and finally got a job as a bartender in a pub. On a night in 2011, Dan finishes his work at the bar and closes it. Although Dan would usually close the bar and leave for home, this night he had plans to drink with his friend Mark, so he leaves for another bar where they were supposed to meet. Mark is Dan's friend who has been mentioned repeatedly throughout this story, but no photo of Mark ever came to light because Dan never let his identity be revealed. Anyway, Dan and Mark meet at that bar and spend their evening drinking and chatting. During the conversation, they don't realize that they've been sitting in this bar for quite a while. And then Mark leaves for his home after meeting. Although it was already 12:00 a.m., Dan still decides that he will drink more, so he takes out his wallet to order more drinks. When Dan takes out his wallet, he realizes that he has no money in it. And Mark, who had paid for their drinks, had already left. In this confusion and drunken state, Dan comes out of the bar and starts looking for an ATM so he can withdraw money to drink. After searching around for a while, Dan finds an ATM. This was a National Australia Bank ATM, and this was the same bank where Dan also had his account. By now it was 12:10 a.m., and it's very important to keep this timing in mind because the entire story revolves around this time. Dan had two cards in his wallet. One was his savings account debit card where he kept his money, and the other was a credit card through which he could transfer money to his savings account as a loan. Dan first puts his debit card into the ATM machine, where he discovers that his account balance is zero. Now Dan had only one option left, and that was to use his credit card. Dan's credit card limit was $2,000. But the biggest problem Dan faced was that his credit card limit had been exhausted, and he had been spending on this same credit card for almost a month, due to which the credit card limit had gone into negative. Even after knowing all this, Dan puts his credit card into the ATM machine, where he sees a balance of $1,995. This clearly meant that only $5 was left before his credit card limit would be completely exhausted. But since Dan was very drunk, he decides to try transferring $200 from his credit card to his debit card. As soon as this idea comes to his mind, he presses the transfer button on the ATM machine, then enters $200 and presses the confirm button. Since only $5 was left before the credit card limit was exhausted, it was impossible for this transaction to complete, and exactly that happened. A few seconds after pressing the confirm button, an error message appears on this ATM machine that read, "This transaction is incorrect," and the credit card automatically comes out of the ATM machine. At such a moment, any normal person would take their cards and leave, because the transaction had failed due to lack of balance. But since Dan was very drunk, he decides to put his debit card back into the ATM machine to check whether 200 had been transferred to the card or not. This time, when he puts the debit card in, instead of showing zero balance, his account shows account balance currently unavailable. Seeing this, Dan becomes very confused and doesn't understand why his zero balance is not showing. In this confusion, Dan presses the withdrawal option visible on the ATM machine, then enters 200 and presses the confirm button. Dan's amazement knew no bounds when instead of an error message appearing on the machine, 200 came out of it. This showed that 200 had been transferred from the credit card to the debit card. But since the credit card limit was exhausted, where did this 200 come from? Due to being very drunk, Dan doesn't pay much attention to how this happened, and he takes this 200 and goes out again to drink. He sits there drinking until 12:50 a.m. And just as he was about to leave for home, suddenly it starts raining heavily. To escape the rain, he starts looking for shelter here and there when he sees the same ATM again from which he had withdrawn money a while ago. There was a shed above this ATM under which he could stand and escape the rain, so Dan goes and stands under that shed. Although he was drunk, after seeing the ATM, this thought starts revolving in his mind about how 200 came out of the machine and how money was transferred from credit card to debit card when his credit card limit was exhausted. Thinking about this, he again decides to repeat this entire process. After entering the ATM again, he puts his debit card into the ATM machine and checks his balance, where again, account balance currently unavailable starts showing. Seeing this, he takes out his debit card and then puts his credit card into the ATM machine, after which he again transfers 200 from credit card to debit card. This time too, the message "transaction is incorrect" starts showing on the ATM machine, and the credit card comes out of the machine. Dan again puts his debit card into the machine, where this time he goes directly to the withdraw option, enters 200, and presses the confirm button. And this time too, the machine gives him 200. Seeing this, a gleam comes in Dan's eyes, and he starts repeating this process by entering larger amounts, in which he entered from 400 to 800, and every time the machine gave him that much money. It was very shocking that despite the credit card limit being exhausted and having zero balance in the savings account, Dan was able to withdraw money from this ATM. And before this night ended, he returned home with 2,000. Due to being very drunk and tired, Dan goes straight to his bed and falls asleep. The next morning, all the events of the previous night start revolving in Dan's mind. At first, he thinks he had some dream at night. But when he opens his wallet and sees 2,000 in it, he becomes convinced that this had actually happened. Seeing this, the first thought that comes to Dan's mind is to check his bank balance. And this time too, his debit card shows zero balance, and his credit card shows the same, 1,995 balance. He was very surprised that his account was showing the same balance that was showing the previous night. But despite this, he had withdrawn 2,000. Now, he starts waiting for the bank to contact him. Dan was constantly haunted by the fear that the police might reach his door because of this fraud. But neither did the police reach his door, nor did the bank contact him. And thus, a whole day passed. Now more than 24 hours had passed since Dan withdrew money from this ATM, and the next morning he wakes up and first contacts the bank to check his account balance. This time, Dan gets a shock hearing his bank balance, because this time his savings account had gone from 0 to 2,000 negative balance, and his credit card balance was showing the same 1,995. This clearly meant that the money Dan had withdrawn from the ATM started showing as minus in his savings account, or in other words, the system had settled and corrected it. Now Dan was in debt of 2,000 on both his credit card and his debit card. This was very strange and unusual because even without having balance in the savings account, no one could withdraw amount from it. Seeing this, Dan gets his account statement from the bank, where another shocking revelation happens before him. Dan sees that not a single transaction that he had made from that ATM was showing in his account statement. Neither the transfers made from credit card to debit card were showing, nor the money withdrawn from debit card was showing. What was showing was just the 2,000 negative balance. This clearly meant that it was recorded in the ATM machine that money had been withdrawn, but there was no record of where this money came from. At such a time, if someone else had been in Dan's place, they would have returned this money to the bank and cleared their debt. But as soon as Dan opens his wallet and sees the money kept in it, only one thought comes to his mind. It's better to have money in hand than having zero balance in the account. And from here, his life takes that turn which made him a famous person throughout Australia. Now Dan starts shopping for himself with this money, in which he buys small household items to refrigerator and washing machine, and also calls his friends to the same pub where he worked for a party. After shopping and partying, he has only 300 left, and instead of returning it to the bank, he decides to gamble with this money so that he can win this money in gambling and return it to the bank. He played this gamble on horse racing because betting on horses was a common thing in Australia, and the pub where he worked had a tie-up with a website called Tab. This website was Australia's largest betting website, where customers would give money to bars to place bets, and bars would place bets for them on the website. Dan also bet 300 on horse races through this website, but he lost all 300 and returned home empty-handed. After returning home this night, Dan starts thinking very carefully about this entire ATM incident. Now his interest was growing in how this happened. And although he was neither from a technical background nor a hacker, despite this, he catches a loophole that was going to change his life forever. After thinking for hours, the loophole that Dan got was the timing of withdrawing money. The night he had withdrawn money from the ATM was after 12:00 a.m. So he decides to withdraw money from the same ATM again after 12:00 a.m. A few days later, Dan reaches the same ATM late at night after finishing his shift at the bar and starts waiting for 12:00 to strike. At 12:05, he enters the ATM and puts his debit card into the ATM machine, where this time his balance was showing 2,000. After taking the debit card out of the machine, he puts his credit card into the machine, where, like before, this time too the balance was showing 1,995. Even knowing that his credit card limit was exhausted, Dan again transfers money from credit card to debit card, and this time the amount to be transferred was 1,000. As soon as he presses the confirm button, this time too the error message, "Transaction is incorrect," starts showing on the screen, and the credit card comes out of the machine. Immediately after this, Dan puts his debit card into this machine, after which a gleam of happiness comes in his eyes. Dan sees that his savings account balance had changed from 2,000 to 1,000, which clearly meant that the 1,000 he had transferred from credit card had been transferred to his savings account. Dan's mind was not ready to believe this, and to confirm again, he puts his credit card into the ATM machine, where the same 1,995 balance was showing. Seeing this, he understands that he has got hold of such a technical glitch that he can change his life with. And he again transfers 1,000 from credit card to debit card, after which his savings account balance changes from 1,000 to 0. In just a few minutes, Dan had paid off the bank's 2,000. But at the same time, he also knew that the system would settle this later and his account would again show minus 2,000. So he again transfers 2,000 from credit card to debit card, after which his account balance starts showing 2,000. Dan withdraws this 2,000, after which his account balance becomes 0 again. Although Dan knew that the system would settle this amount, he wanted to know when this amount gets settled. Taking the money, Dan returns home and goes to sleep. And the next morning, as soon as he wakes up, he first contacts the bank, where he finds out that his balance is still 0. Throughout this day, Dan contacted the bank several times to find out his balance, and every time he got the same answer: zero balance. And thus, evening turned to night. The next morning, Dan again contacts the bank, where this time he finds out that his account balance had become minus 4,000. This clearly meant that the system had settled all transactions, in which the 2,000 he had withdrawn the first night and the 2,000 he had withdrawn the second night had all been settled and become minus 4,000. Dan was beginning to understand that this method wouldn't work for many days because he could withdraw money from the ATM. But when this amount gets settled and becomes more negative, he could get into big trouble. This bank had an automatic system that if any account's negative balance reached 20,000, that account would automatically get frozen and the bank would send a legal notice to that customer. Dan now dedicates himself day and night to finding a solution to this problem, and then his attention goes to two things. First, that the system takes more than a full day for this settlement, and second, that after 12:00 a.m. at night, the bank ATM goes into standby mode, due to which the ATM gets disconnected from the main banking system for 1 hour. And this was the reason why money was being transferred very easily from credit card to debit card. During this time, an idea comes to Dan's mind that if he does this transfer every night between 12 to 1, he can settle the previous night's minus balance. For example, if he withdrew 2,000 one night, he would transfer 2,000 again to the same account the next night before that amount becomes negative, due to which his account balance would remain zero. By continuing this cycle, his balance would always remain zero because this settlement takes more than 24 hours. According to this strategy, Dan would have to transfer and withdraw these funds every day, due to which this amount would keep increasing. For example, if Dan withdraws 1,000 one night, then the next night he would have to transfer 2,000 from his credit card to his savings account so that he can withdraw 1,000 and also settle the previous night's 1,000 before it goes negative. Similarly, if he wants to withdraw 1,000 on the third night, he would have to transfer 3,000 from his credit card to his debit card so that he can withdraw money and also settle the balance of the previous 2 nights. This clearly meant that the amount transferred every night would keep adding up and increasing. This bank's ATM also provided the facility that he could transfer any 6-figure amount, due to which he could transfer 999 in one transaction and transfer the same amount in any transaction if needed. Dan now had to do these transactions every night, and if he missed even one transaction any night, all the money he had withdrawn so far would get settled and start showing negative in his account. For example, if he had withdrawn $1 lakh in the past few nights, then missing just one night's transaction would cause a negative balance of minus 1 lakh to show in his account. And seeing such a large negative amount, the bank would immediately issue a legal notice in his name. During this time, Dan also found out that he could do these transactions at any ATM of this bank. And due to this, wherever he was, he would go to an ATM every night and withdraw a large amount. Although Dan also regretted his actions, he then thought that he was not stealing from any one person but from a bank, which itself does the work of robbing people. Dan had not told his friends or his fiancée about this so far, and within just 1 week, he had withdrawn 20 from the ATM. He used this money to throw parties for his friends and gamble on horse racing, in which his friends enthusiastically participated. Dan now started spending this money lavishly, and many times he would pay the bill of all the people sitting in the bar from his own pocket so that people would look at him with respect. With this money, Dan was living the life he had always wanted to live. Now gradually, people around Dan started noticing where all this money was coming from because he was just an ordinary waiter and his financial condition was not so good that he could afford such expenses. When Dan's friends questioned him, he told them that he had won large amounts in horse racing several times, and people very easily believed this lie of Dan's. But they were all completely unaware that in reality Dan was losing badly in gambling and was completely drowned in debt. Dan had already lost up to 40-0 in horse racing. And during this time, one day when he reaches his work, he sees the bar manager talking to someone on the phone. This manager was talking to the betting site administration on the phone, where he was telling them that Dan was placing big bets in horse racing, and they suspected that he was scamming them. They believed that Dan was placing these bets with customers' money, and he was taking money from them but not depositing this money in the safe. Hearing this, the manager immediately checks the safe. But all the money was exactly right, according to the accounting. Seeing this, the manager falls into amazement and confusion about how Dan was placing such big bets. The amount of money Dan was betting in a day was what the bar earned from betting in an entire month, and from here the manager starts suspecting him. Meanwhile, the betting site also closes Dan's account, and now he couldn't place any bet on their website. And here the bar owner starts feeling that Dan is involved in illegal activities like drug dealing, so he fires him from the job. The city named Wantala, where Dan was living, had a population of only 30-0. And being a small city, most people there knew each other. This was the reason why this news about Dan reached everywhere, including his fiancée. As soon as Dan's fiancée finds out about this, she messages Dan saying that she cannot live with a person who is involved in any kind of illegal activities, and she breaks up with him. This news broke Dan completely, and now he starts feeling very lonely. Then Dan decides to tell his closest friend Mark everything about the ATM matter. Dan tells Mark that he has found an ATM loophole due to which he can withdraw as much money as he wants from the ATM. After hearing this, Mark tells him that he doesn't want to involve himself in this matter, but he won't tell anyone about it, and their friendship won't be affected. During this conversation, Dan tells Mark that they should go on a vacation, to which Mark immediately agrees, and they both leave for Melbourne, Australia. After reaching Melbourne, they stay at the 5-star Hotel Crown Towers, where for the first time Dan realizes that he can live a wonderful life with money. From here, Dan gets the habit of luxury that he never looked back after. Dan's mind was constantly revolving around the fact that he had to find that bank's ATM by night so that he could complete his transaction without skipping. And he finds that ATM where he reaches after 12:00 a.m. at night and transfers a large amount from credit card and withdraws money. The next morning, Dan reaches a casino with this money along with Mark, where they both sit the whole day gambling. They were playing one game after another and losing thousands of dollars in every game. But they didn't care about money because they knew that every night they could withdraw unlimited money from the ATM. Now they both started going to the casino every day. And in just a few days, they lost so much money that they couldn't have earned in an entire year. Anyway, after a few days, Mark tells Dan that they should go back now because he also has to return to his work. But Dan, who had become addicted to luxury, tells Mark to go back, and he himself stays in Melbourne. Now Dan needed to withdraw large amounts from the ATM to run this cycle, and due to not having that much cash in the ATM, he was facing a lot of trouble withdrawing this amount. Then Dan makes a risky decision. Due to withdrawing and transferring money every day, Dan's account balance had become about 300 in just 1 month. To withdraw a large amount like 100 from this account balance, he had to go inside the bank, and this was psychologically very difficult for Dan because he knew he was stealing. Due to this, he always had the fear that the bank could find out about his fraud anytime, and the police could come after him anytime. Anyway, Dan had to withdraw money, and due to not having much cash in the ATM, he reaches a bank one day to withdraw a large amount. Dan knew very well that during this time he would have to be very alert, and this was the reason why. To understand the bank's reaction, he first asks the bank employee about his account balance. The bank employee tells him that he has 373,247 in his account, and also asks how much money he would like to withdraw. Seeing this, Dan's fear reduces and his confidence increases. Seeing the bank employee's normal behavior, Dan decides to withdraw 100. Before handing over such a large amount, bank employees have to get approval from the bank manager. And this was the reason why she goes to the bank manager's cabin to get approval. Seeing the bank employee taking quite a while in the cabin, Dan's fear and nervousness start increasing, and he starts feeling that they have found out about his fraud and have called the police. In this thought and confusion, Dan was about to leave the bank when, after 25 minutes, that bank employee comes out of the manager's cabin and counts and gives the full 100 to Dan. Seeing this, a gleam comes in Dan's eyes, and now he could withdraw as much money as he wanted from the bank, for which he didn't even need to go to an ATM now. Despite all this happening, Dan had an idea that one day he would definitely be caught. So he decides to openly indulge and live a life of luxury with this money. Now Dan had been living in Melbourne for about 10 days, and after withdrawing 100 this time, he invites his group of friends. He tells all his friends to take leave from their work for a few days and spend their holidays with him, the entire cost of which he would bear. Dan books rooms in 5-star hotels for all his friends and also tells them to order whatever they want to eat and live however they want. He wanted to give them that life experience which they had never even dreamed of. Dan's group of friends consisted of 4 people, including 2 boys and 2 girls, and Dan tells 2 of them about his ATM fraud. One of them tells Dan that he has no interest in knowing more details because he doesn't want to get into any problem, and he has come here just to enjoy. Now, Dan and his 4 friends were openly indulging, in which they started roaming around by renting limousines and helicopters. Also, Dan would tell the waiter at whatever restaurant he went to put the bill of all customers sitting in the restaurant on his account. Dan's indulgence can be gauged from the fact that he would sometimes book everything from entire floors of hotels to swimming pools so that he could party there with his friends. Also, he gave them expensive gifts and paid off their loans. During this time, a good side of Dan was also seen, in which he sees a person playing guitar on the roadside who had no one around to listen. Then he gathers people there by paying them money so that they would listen to his guitar and also gives thousands of dollars to the guitar player. Dan didn't just indulge with this money, but also did many good deeds, in which he would often take people living on the roadside to expensive hotels for food and make them stay in the same hotel for one night. Among all these indulgences and good deeds, Dan was taking special care that he must do transactions from ATM every night, and none of his transactions should be missed, because missing even one transaction meant the end of his entire luxury. He had set several alarms after 12:00 a.m. every night, so that as soon as the alarm rang, he would immediately go to an ATM and complete his transaction between 12 to 1 a.m. at night. 4 months had passed since Dan had been withdrawing money from the ATM. And the most shocking thing was that he had withdrawn $1 million from the ATM so far, which neither the bank nor the credit card department knew about. Once Dan rented a plane for 90 and went to Bali Island in Indonesia. And he also rented that entire island for 2 days where he could openly indulge. Since there was no ATM on this island, Dan gives both his credit card and debit card to one of his friends, and specifically explains to him that he has to do these transactions every night without skipping. Although Dan was living his dream life with this money, during these 4 months, a fear always haunted him that the bank could catch this glitch anytime and he would be caught. This was the reason why he always lived in stress and fear, due to which he couldn't sleep peacefully. To reduce this stress and get peaceful sleep, he started drinking a lot of alcohol. And finally, after 5 months of mental pressure, he breaks down. When Dan starts understanding that he can't do this anymore, he calls his 3 friends, including Mark, and tells them that he can't bear this mental pressure and fear anymore, and now he will stop all this. Dan also tells them that before stopping all this, he will withdraw money one last time, and they can buy whatever they want or take as much money as they need. After this last transaction, the amount Dan had withdrawn so far was $1.6 million. The night after this transaction, Dan neither went to the ATM nor withdrew money. This was the first time in the past 5 months that he had not withdrawn money from the ATM. And now a negative balance of $1.6 million was going to show in his account. All of Dan's friends meet him one last time, and all leave for their respective homes, while Dan stays in the same hotel with 80 cash. Dan hides this cash in his room's bathroom and starts waiting for a call from the bank or for the police to catch him. After more than 24 hours had passed, a negative balance of 1.6 million starts showing in Dan's account. And just a few days later, Dan receives a call from the bank. On the phone, the bank manager tells Dan that some unusual activity has occurred in his account and also asks what he knows about it. Hearing this, Dan tells the bank manager that he doesn't know anything about it, to which the bank manager says that they will investigate this entire matter and call him back. The bank manager also threatens Dan, saying that if they find anything against him, they will file a complaint against him with the police. After this conversation, Dan stays in the same hotel waiting for the bank's call, which takes a whole month, and no call comes from the bank. Finally, tired Dan calls the bank himself this time so that he can know what steps the bank is going to take in his case. This time, there was a female bank employee on the other side of the call, to whom Dan tells about his entire case, and that employee puts Dan's call on hold. After about 20 minutes, the bank manager comes on that call again and tells Dan that he won't get any more money and why. You know this. Dan tells the bank manager that he doesn't want any money, but has called to know about the unusual activity in his account. Hearing this, the bank manager tells Dan that you are a bad person, and this case has been handed over to the police for investigation, and you have ruined your entire life with your own hands. After this call, Dan was convinced that now the police could come to arrest him at the hotel any time, so he stays in the same hotel waiting. But this time, too, a whole month passed, and neither any news came from the bank, nor did the police come to catch him. Dan now decides to go back to his city Wantala from Melbourne because his money was also running out. After reaching Wantala, he starts waiting for a notice from the police. This time, too, several months passed in this wait, but neither any notice came from the police, nor did the police come to arrest him. During these months, Dan was constantly talking to the bank, in which they would threaten to get him arrested every time. First 1 year, and then 2 years passed in all this, but nothing happened. It seemed that the bank was just acting to scare and threaten him, but was not doing anything, due to which the matter was dragging on. Because of this, Dan again started living in fear and nervousness all the time. Dan also talked to several lawyers about this matter and told them about his entire case, but no lawyer helped him because this matter was very unusual and no one could understand it. Because the bank was constantly calling Dan to scare and threaten him, but was neither getting him caught nor letting him go, Dan starts feeling that he is trapped and cannot live his life in a normal way. He couldn't understand whether the bank was playing some game with him or couldn't take any legal action against him. 2 years had passed since Dan's transactions, and due to constant threats, Dan couldn't bear this mental pressure and completely broke down. Dan now wanted at any cost for the bank to take some action and for this matter to end forever. Then Dan makes a risky decision. This time, Dan contacts Australia's most famous newspaper and tells them his entire story, after which they call him to their office for an interview. The journalist who was taking Dan's interview also arranged a suit and a dummy plane for Dan so that he could take exactly the same photos for his stories as Dan had lived his life. Although this newspaper printed Dan's article and his photo in the newspaper, it didn't get much attention, and the bank's attention didn't go towards it either. Dan wanted the bank to take action as soon as possible due to public pressure, so this time he contacts Australia's most popular TV show, Current Affair. The producers and creators of this show are very impressed by Dan's story and call him for a documentary shoot for a whole week. They also rent hotels, planes, and cars to show Dan's luxurious life, in which he had openly indulged with the bank's money. After the documentary shoot, Dan starts waiting for its editing to broadcast because Dan was sure that once this show was broadcast, the bank would have to take some action because this show was quite popular among people and millions of people watched it. Anyway, after weeks of waiting, this show was broadcast on TV. But at the end of this show, something happened that made the ground slip from under Dan's feet. In this show, the minor details of Dan's fraud were denied, and at the end of this show, it was told that Dan is a fugitive against whom the police have issued a warrant, and if anyone knows anything about him, they should inform the police. Dan was very surprised and confused by this, and couldn't believe why the producers of such a big show lied so much that he was a fugitive when he himself had gone to them to tell his story. To make this story more sensational, the show's producers played another trick. On the night this show was broadcast, a producer of the show emails Dan and tells him that his personality is very charming, and they enjoyed working with him very much, and if he wants, he can come to the office and collect the photos and documents of this show. Although after reading this email, Dan feels something strange, since he was in confusion about why they lied in his story and also wanted to end this matter forever. He reaches the TV show's office on Thursday morning. As soon as Dan enters the building, he is shocked to see many photographers around him who had surrounded him from all sides. Before Dan could understand, a police officer comes to him and arrests him. All this was being recorded in the cameras of the photographers standing nearby. And then Dan starts understanding that the channel people had done this to make their show more sensational, so that by showing Dan's arrest at the end, they could get maximum TRP and also create a good image of their channel that they had caught a criminal. Although Dan himself had told his story to the media channel, despite this, they used him for their benefit, which shows how dark and dirty the world of media is. Anyway, after arresting Dan, that police officer takes him to the police station where he takes his fingerprints. But during this time, a strange thing happened, and that was that Dan was put in jail without any questioning. During this time, Dan is given a lawyer to defend him, after which that lawyer made several shocking and amazing revelations. The first revelation was that the police officer who had arrested Dan was not the investigation officer of this case, and this show's producer and this police officer had a very good friendship. Taking advantage of this, they had Dan arrested. This clearly meant that this police officer had arrested Dan just to show on camera so that the show would get a proper ending according to the channel's created story, and also good TRP. Dan got the biggest shock when he found out that the bank had never filed any complaint against him, nor was any investigation running against him. Dan now starts understanding that the bank never wanted people to know that their banking system had many flaws, due to which just one person managed to steal $1.6 million from them. This was the reason why they were just acting to scare and threaten him so that he would return their money himself. And they didn't file any complaint with the police. The bank was afraid that if this news came out, customers would lose trust in them, due to which their share prices would also fall, and they would have to suffer a loss bigger than theft. Even after Dan's arrest, the bank gave a statement to the press that they had nothing to do with this case. Otherwise, they would have to show all their accounting details and take responsibility for this fraud. Since Dan had confessed in the TV show that he had done all this fraud, the case goes to court. But due to no testimony from the bank's side, the court sentences him to just 1 year. After completing his sentence, Dan came out of jail, after which he gave interviews to several TV shows and also wrote a book on his story. Because Dan claimed that he had withdrawn $1.6 million, but due to no statement from the bank's side, it could never be found out till today how much money he actually withdrew. How did you like this story? Please write in the comments section and let us know. Like and subscribe to the channel. See you in the next video.